What's going on, everybody? So today I want to go over Firefly because allegedly she's going to be getting buffed sometime in the first half of 2026. Why is she getting buffed alone instead of being buffed with the other 4 characters and the rest of the Stellar Hunters? I don't know, but better late than never, right? So let's get into it. Now, it's highly likely, like this leak is almost guaranteed to happen, very reliable, but Firefly is supposedly getting buffed sometime in the first half of 2026, meaning somewhere between version 4.0 and version 4.3. 4.4 is likely, but it's a possibility, but it's not likely, I should say, because it's going to be deep into summer. So most certainly somewhere between version 4.0 and 4.3, which is not that far from now. Now here's the thing, right? Firefly does need a buff right now given her current state, but it may not be for the reason that you're thinking. Now, Firefly doesn't have the greatest damage multipliers by today's standards, right? Compared to Finon, it's not even close. Compared to D-Herda, it is a kind of close, but D-Herda's most certainly going to be better. D-Herda is almost always going to be better. But the thing with Firefly is she didn't fall off because of power creep entirely. That is a part of it, but that's not all of it. Even given Firefly's worst case scenario, the most generic, basic, low effort team comp you could come up with, Firefly herself at E0S0, Renmei E0S0, Harmony Trailblazer, and then Gallagher, right? I just described my team comp with Firefly, no Adelons, no best in slot Lycones or anything like that. Firefly's damage in that case is still great, but that's only when the enemies are weakness broken. And the thing with Firefly back then is her damage output was insane, but she only had a small time window to actually deal the damage, which is why she seemed like she did so much damage at first. But now she has good damage multipliers. The issue now is consistency. The thing with Honkai Star Rail that no one wants to talk about, or no one seems to even notice at this point, is weakness bar inflation, which is absolutely a real thing. HP inflation does exist, and that is one thing, but I've already made enough videos going over that. I don't think that's the main outlier here. It's weakness bar inflation. You may or may not have noticed, but sometime around when the whole break meta was at its highest point, right, with Rappa and Fugue and all that, the weakness of the enemies started to skyrocket. Fugue was being shielded heavily. If you don't have Fugue, it's really hard, almost impossible in some cases, using Firefly in modern day endgame, and even with Fugue, it is still a challenge actually shredding the weakness bars of the enemies, which is the entire point of Firefly. You want to take down those toughness bars so that you can actually deal the damage. Otherwise, Firefly just does not do any damage at all, right? Whether she has a break build, whether she has a crit build, no matter what, her kit will not allow her to deal any kind of damage whatsoever unless the enemies are weakness broken. But that's just so unbelievably difficult to actually do right now. And whether you have Fugue, whether you have Silver Wolf, no matter what characters you use, you're gonna struggle taking down those weakness bars. The only way you can compensate for that is if your Firefly can do enough damage to make up for it. But the thing is, if you have an E0S0 Firefly, she's just not going to be able to do that much damage, right? Assuming all 3 enemies that you're attacking with Firefly have their weakness bars broken, so you're dealing maximum damage output, right? Realistically, right, if you have an E0S0 Firefly, you could be hitting for 400k per hit, 500k, which is good, but you only get a few good hits in before either the enemies get back up, or let's say Firefly gets out of her ult, which absolutely can happen, and it does happen a lot for me. At least my Firefly has 156 speed. She has a good amount of speed, so she gets action relatively quickly, so I can get her back into her ult, no problem. But when Firefly gets out of her ult while the enemies are down, that's an issue. And why I'm bringing this up is because it takes so long to actually break the toughness bars of the enemies with Firefly. By the time that you can actually finally deal the damage that you should be doing to those enemies, Firefly gets out of her ult and then you're cooked, right? A lot of that happens to a lot of people. I've seen so many Firefly runs, you know, in modern day Honkai Star Rail endgame where that just happens. It happens to myself, right? I don't have Fugue. I do have Linkshot E0 S0 now as of version 3.0, but that doesn't really help out, right? Firefly, or Linkshot I should say, is fire, which is great because that way I can shred a little bit of the toughness bars, but it doesn't help. If you've ever tried using Linkshot's skill against an enemy with fire weakness, you'll be able to see in the end game it's not a lot. She doesn't really do much. She takes off maybe a millimeter of the actual bar itself. So Firefly most definitely needed this buff, but I hope that they handle her buff the same way that they did with the other characters, right? Think of the other DPSs like Blade, Jingliu, and Kafka who have gotten buffed. They're a lot better. They're noticeably better. In fact, my best ever Apocalyptic Shadow run came from me using Finon on one side and then Jingliu on the other, which is crazy, right? In a modern day Honkai Star Rail endgame. But I hope that they can handle, you know, Firefly's buffs the same way, right? With the other DPSs that we've seen gotten buffed, they're a lot better, but they're not at the top of the meta, right? And I did talk about that before in some other videos where I was worried that this game's meta was going to be completely skewered and messed up. I thought that newer DPSs might be rendered obsolete if older DPSs from a whole nother era could compete with new DPSs, right? I was thinking that Jingliu was going to be competing with Aglaya in terms of damage. I was mistaken. I was wrong, right? Jingliu not even close to Aglaya, Herta, Finon. She is not on that tier still. She is a little bit better, noticeably better, but not that good. Now, if they're going to be buffing Firefly, what they should do is they should increase how much she can actually take on the weakness bars of the enemies when she does use her skill in her ult state. Because as it stands right now, she hits like a pool noodle, right? She hits like a pool noodle, not just in terms of damage when the enemies aren't weakness broken, but also to the actual like toughness bar itself. She just doesn't shred enough. And so like I said, there's so many situations where she'll be out of her ult state by the time that the enemies are down, right? Renmei's ult allowing them to stay down, weakness broken further, does help out, but not really that much. You can't get that many good hits in with Firefly given this current state when it comes to the break meta. And that's the final thing I want to talk about in this video. Buffs aren't enough, because if the HP inflation, if the meta is going to continue shifting at this rate, a unit getting buffed is just going to immediately fall back down in the meta in you know, a few months time, right? What they should be doing is releasing units to support that type of archetype. For example, with break meta, we're not seeing any kind of support with break meta whatsoever. Ever since Firefly came out, we've had Fugue release as a support, and that's it, right? When you think of, you know, generalist units or crit scaling units, there's a lot more that's coming out. Think of Ceridra, think of, you know, Finon, right? In terms of DPS and support alike, think of Mighty, right? Crit scaling DPSs and crit scaling supports is kind of like the main thing in Honkai Star Rail. But that's the thing, right? This game is so focused on, you know, crit overall that for anything else, right? Think of dot, think of follow-up attack meta, right? Think of any meta that isn't, you know, strictly crit and attack, right? Like the generic combo that you want to go with. It's just not going to be able to keep up the same, right? Some better than others, right? Follow-up attack meta is not really doing too bad right now. There's still a lot of units that can do follow-up attacks, but when it comes to break, there's just not enough support for it, which we're seeing that now with Dot, right? Dot has Hissolence coming out and the buffs, so, you know, Dot will definitely rise up, but we're not seeing that with break yet. There's no information on a new break unit coming out anytime soon, whether it's a DPS or a harmony, right, or a support, a sustain, anything like that. We don't need a break meta support, right? But you get what I mean. Nothing like that. Not at 3.5, not at 3.6, not at 3.7. The earliest that we could see a brand new break unit coming is version 4.0, because we have no information on 4.0 at all other than what the region's design could possibly be, along with the region itself allegedly. But even that we're not too sure on. But that's about it for this video. Just to summarize things, if they're going to be buffing Firefly's kit, it's not the damage that they should be focusing on. That is one thing, right? But another thing is actually being able to break down the toughness bars of the enemies, because Firefly right now just cannot do it. Even if you have a solid team comp, right? Firefly, Ren Mei, Harmony Trailblazer, Linkshot, it's just not going to be enough. Linkshot can tickle the toughness bars a little bit, right? Help that out sooner, but the difference is so small that it's not even noticeable. It's gotten to a point where up until I benched Firefly, which was really this patch, right? Because of Finon's release. Before then, I was still using Firefly, but for a while, it got to a point where if the enemies had imaginary weakness, I would just start using Harmony Trailblazer's skill, hoping that the bounces would attack the boss or the enemies that I needed to take on the toughest bars of, because of how difficult it was otherwise, right? For the whole team is struggling. But that's about it for this video. I have nothing else to say, so I'll see y'all. Goodbye.